This is the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. This episode is sponsored by Funding Loop. Funding Loop automates the process for nurseries of collecting funding forms from parents and typing that information into council portals. To find out more about Funding Loop, visit their website. You'll find the link in this episode description. Hiya, just a really quick message from me. I'd really love to ask for a little favor from those listening and watching. So wherever you're listening, wherever you're watching on, whatever platform it is, please do hit the subscribe button. This really helps the Voice of Early Childhood to continue putting out those thought-provoking episodes and continue making sure that we share those diverse voices and give you the topics and guests that you want to hear from. And for those of you who already subscribe, thank you very much. This helps so much. And everyone, thank you for listening, watching, and supporting the Voice of Early Childhood. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. My name is Angelica Solinska. I'm your host. And today I'm joined by Professor Sam Was, who is a neuroscientist, and Dr. Gemma Goldenberg, who is an education expert. And they are both working at the Institute for the Science of Early Years, based at the University of East London. So thank you both very much for coming onto the podcast.
Hi.
Great. Yeah, nice to be here.
It's great to have you both. And I know, Gemma, you've already recorded a few episodes. I think it was over a year ago now, around the science of outdoor play and your PhD. So that's really exciting to have you back and seeing your work progress further and start working with Professor Sam. So today we are talking about taking action on distraction. So Gemma and Sam, together you've written a guide to improving attention and focus in the early years and in Key Stage 1. And this has just been released and it's called Take Action on Distraction. From my understanding, it's all about, educators understanding how attention works in order to be able to help children improve and self-regulate their focus. So it sounds like a really important book, and as I said, just published end of February 2025. So very exciting. So I thought, let's set the scene. Why did you both decide to carry out this work on attention? So why is attention such a crucial topic in early childhood education?
Yeah, so I think the reason particularly why we're interested in concentration, so basically I've always, from my PhD, 15 years ago, I've always been focusing on the development of concentration skills in early childhood. And the reason is because it's thought to be really important as a gateway skill. So it's a skill that you acquire in a subsequent acquisition of other skills. Yeah. So there are various different ways in which concentration can be atypical. Anyone working in an earlier setting will be used to the idea that, there are some children that are very, highly active and they find it very hard to, sit and engage and focus on one thing for a long period of time. But there are also children down the other end of the scale who are kind of quite passive and quite quiet and will be, sitting and kind of keeping their eyes focused on you without necessarily moving a lot. But internally, they're having problems, focusing on what you're saying. Their minds will drift off, start wondering about something like that. So those are two kind of extremes of the scale that are both characterized by difficulties and challenges in kind of concentrating and focusing on one thing at once. And the reason that it's a really important thing is because if I'm having problems focusing my attention like that, I find it harder to pick up language because I find it harder to tune into what one person's saying in order to learn from what they're saying. But then during later childhood, it's something that affects, English learning, phonics learning, maths learning, during later childhood, all of the other topics. And it leads to these kind of cascade-like problems of development over time. So that's why I think for me, focusing on kind of attention and focus during early childhood is really important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think for me, from a teaching perspective, just remembering what it's like to have 30 children in front of you and they're not paying attention to you is exhausting. And, I used to feel so frustrated. Like I just want to teach, but I can't because I'm constantly battling just to capture their focus, and it makes, like I said, it makes it very exhausting and sometimes very frustrating. And I used to think if they were just paying attention, everything else would fall into place. So yeah, I sort of wanted to try and help teachers with that. And I think often as well, difficulties with attention can be misconstrued as behaviour problems. And so children kind of get a name for being the one who's always got their name on the sad face or the red traffic light or whatever it is. And they kind of pick up this reputation for being a difficult child. Whereas actually, if they could have that help and support with attention at an earlier stage, then it might not get to that point.
And Gemma, you mentioned something there, attention capturing children's attention. I know in the book you talk about getting a balance between attention capture and attention control. So can you talk us through about what do we mean by attention capture and why is that different to attention control?
Yeah, so it's something we talk about right at the start of the book, this kind of difference between two types of attention. So we give the example in the book of a fly buzzing around the classroom, and any kind of insect, to be honest, that anyone in that situation knows that the children all immediately stop listening to what you're saying and focusing on this fly that's buzzing around the room. And we kind of question, well, why is that? Like, flies are not that interesting. Why would it capture children in that way? And we talk about how movement and noise and bright colours just kind of grab our attention really, really effortlessly. And, that's for evolutionary reasons. It's a natural instinct, because as early humans, if there was something moving in our field of vision, it's likely to be either something that might come and eat us or something that we want to go and eat. And so our brains are kind of programmed, from birth almost, to kind of immediately latch on to kind of movement and noise. And so, even very young children are great at that. And we know that from if a car alarm goes off or whatever, that they don't have to try to pay attention to those things. It just happens very naturally. Whereas attention control is very different, and we kind of give the analogy of a spotlight for that, being able to control the spotlight of your attention and choose what you want to focus in on and what you want to ignore. That's a very different thing. And there's, that's something that develops much more slowly over time. So children in the early years, for example, we know that their prefrontal cortex is still developing, and that's responsible for that type of attention control. So we find that much easier as adults or even as older children. For young children, that's still a real challenge. So, we talk about helping children develop that ability to control the focus of their attention.
Can I just add one thing to that as well? So that was beautifully put by Gemma. So this idea of attention control, so the attention spotlight, so we can think about it in terms of kind of vision. So if I'm, looking at the teacher's face, I'm trying to ignore kind of stuff that's happening around the periphery of the teacher's face in my visual field. But we can also think about it in terms of kind of auditory information. So, imagine as an adult, you're sitting having a conversation with, your family at a restaurant, and then you suddenly, my mum always used to do this, it used to drive us mad as a family, you suddenly start tuning into the conversation of the person that people are having at the next door table. And you can, it's very well proven that you can voluntarily choose to switch your auditory attention from one person to another person when you're in a setting where you can hear both people talking at once. So this idea of attention control, it's not just physically a spotlight in terms of vision, but it's also, internally in terms of auditory stuff as well.
That's really interesting. And I guess, does this then link to those distractions around children? I know you talk about kind of visual and auditory clutter and their barriers for attention. So talk us through a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, well, just before we get onto that, Angelica, just one thing I just want to say, because I thought it might be a nice lead into that, is basically the way that we used to think of attention control, and this is, even in my career as a neuroscientist, is we used to think of this, capacity to focus your attention quite like a mental muscle. So it's something that can be trained over time. So I actually spent my PhD 15 years ago designing kind of games. So they're actually kind of computer games that we spent a long time working with kind of babies and young children. If it was a child, this was funded by the Medical Research Council UK, and it was basically, if there's a child that we're worried is going to not develop kind of good concentration later in development because they've got an older sibling with ADHD, for example, or other factors that we know put you at high risk, like being born very prematurely, that type of things. The idea was to take these kind of high risk children and put them into a targeted program of training their concentration skills, so giving them concentration training exercises to try to improve their key learning skills. The idea is the earlier you start in development, the easier it ought to be, kind of in theory. And we now know from quite a lot of research done by me and lots of other people around the world that this approach just doesn't work. It's not a very effective way of kind of improving a child's concentration skills. So when we were asked to write this book, Gemma and I kind of set out with this. Okay, well, we know that the obvious way, giving concentration training exercises to a child isn't effective. But what else can we do? So if I've got a child who's struggling to concentrate, what else can we do? So one of the things to start with is the question that you asked, Angelica. So we can think, and we talk a lot about this in the book, about designing a setting that is easy to concentrate in. And that is about this idea of attention capture. So that kind of breaks down in lots and lots of different ways. Firstly, as Gemma was mentioning, movement behind our field of view is very distracting. It's very, very hard to tune out. So we talk about, how do you design your setting so that when, you're doing circle time or something like that, and you want all the children in your group to be looking at you, they don't have movement distracting in the background. And similarly, again, Gemma already mentioned, there's a lot of evidence that things like bright lights and colors and sharp edges also kind of attract our attention, so also drive attention capture in the same way. So we can also think about, how can I design my setting so that children have got a blank background? There aren't a lot of, sharp edges kind of overlapping with my face from their point of view. Do you want to talk some more, Gemma? I need to drink some water.
Yeah, so there's been some really interesting studies on this that people are often quite surprised to hear, I think, where they've taught children a series of lessons, either in like a really decorated classroom with lots of displays and posters on the walls, or a much more plain, streamlined classroom. And the children are much more off task in a decorated classroom. And because they're less on task, it tends to lead to lower learning outcomes. So they remember less of the content from that lesson, or if they're asked questions about the material they were taught, they don't score so well. And that's not to say you've got to take absolutely everything off of the walls. A room can be kind of too plain, and then it's, potentially not stimulating enough. But kind of research suggests it's about 25% of the wall space is the tipping point. So once you're covering more than about 25% of your wall space, that is becoming distracting, because it's all visual information that the children have to process, and we don't think about that as adults because we might just kind of glance at it and that's that. But especially with very young children, it does take brain resource to be able to process those things. And like Sam said, especially if there's complex patterns and lots of edges and stripes and things like that. But particularly, as Sam said, it's about thinking about what's behind you as the adult, when the focus is on you. So, if you want to have displays in the room, then potentially just thinking about where those are positioned, so that they're not behind you. And it's just a really good idea to kind of sit down on your carpet area or wherever the children normally sit and get down at their level and look at what that environment is like from kind of their viewpoint, and what potential distractions are there.
Can I just add one more thing on vision, and then I want to talk about hearing as well. So one more thing on vision that I think is important is when children, when it's choosing time or something like that, when they're in a setting where they can control how they position themselves relative to the things that they're paying attention to, then in a lot of ways concentration becomes much easier, because if I'm a child and I'm paying attention to something, I'll often naturally pick it up and hold it close to my close to my face, and at that point it's much easier because attention capture is driving their attention to that object, and because it will be more prominent in their visual field, it will be occupying a large part of their visual field, and they'll be positioned in a way that children moving on the other side of the room aren't kind of in their visual field, so they don't have to concentrate on, they don't have to think about not paying attention to it. So this idea of having a flexible space where children can position themselves and choose where to position themselves and pick up things and bring them close to them when they're interested in them is really, really important, because it lets the child design their own visual field so that they can help them focus on something. So that's important too. Just quickly again, just to jump from visual attention to auditory attention. So the other thing that's really important is background noise. So there's this idea of attention capture that we started with is true for adults, but it's even more so true for children and young children. Their brains find it harder to filter out kind of background noise. Yeah. And we know that from studies that we do in my lab, where we basically record the brain activity of a child. And with older children, you can play them kind of headphones with two speakers in their ears at once. So one person's talking through their one ear and the other's talking through the other ear. And with older children, you can ask them to choose to pay attention to the voice in their left ear and the voice in their right ear. Yeah. And when they're doing that and you're measuring their brain activity, you can see that the rhythms in their brain activity are changing to match the speech rhythms of the person that they're paying attention to. Yeah. And even when you get 7 to 12-year-old children to do that task, you compare it to adults, we can see that the brain rhythms of the 7 to 12-year-old are still more influenced by the voice that they're trying to ignore compared to adults. So our adult brains are very good at doing this task. And children, even as I say, primary age, but particularly early years, are more affected by background noise. Yeah. So this is really, really important. So there's loads of evidence that, really early on in development, we learn best from one person talking to us against a background of complete silence. Yeah. In homes, homes where there's a telly always going on in the background, that is shown to directly associate with worse kind of language development in children. Obviously, this is a massive challenge for anyone working in an early years setting, because earlier settings are noisy. Everyone's talking at once, you're doing a lot of child-led learning, that type of stuff. So we talk a lot in the book about, practical tips for how we can reduce kind of distracting background noise to make it easier for the children in your setting to focus in on your voice when you're talking to them.
I do think that as well, though, sometimes people just aren't aware. Like, I've definitely had that when I've been teaching before, especially in early years where you've got quite a few adults often in the room because of kind of the adult-child ratios. And sometimes other adults in the room will just kind of gather and chat while you're reading a story or while you're trying to teach phonics. And they are, they're probably talking about work or what they're going to set up next. And they might even be talking quite quietly, but without realising that is still really inhibiting like the learning that's happening and making it really difficult for the children to block out that conversation and listen to what the teacher's doing instead. So I do think even at that most basic level, without going on to kind of the other tips that we have about what you can do when you really can't manage the noise in the environment and you've just got to manage in a noisy setting, then what can you do to help the children cope? But I do think at kind of the first level, plan A is just to try to reduce that background chatter a bit from the other adults. You can't necessarily do it with the children. We don't want to ask them to be silent all the time. But yeah, just bringing the other adults' awareness to that and why it is a problem.
And how about people often say, and I know this might be different with children as opposed to adults, that they do need some background noise or something. Sometimes they put music, on and things like that to help them focus. Is that about filtering out specific noise that they can kind of tune into that conversation and just have some more mellow background noise, or something that they can't actually tune into the detail of it?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, actually, Angelica. There's a couple of points to make about that. So I guess the first one is, another thing that we talk about a lot in the book is the relationship between kind of stress, whether I'm overstressed or understressed, whether I'm, drifting off to sleep or overexcited, bouncing off the ceilings, and how that affects your focus. We do kind of a lot of research where we're measuring. Actually, Gemma did this for her very first kind of master's project with me, where she was measuring the heart rate of the children in her settings. This was when she was still teaching, and she had her class that she knew very well, and she put a little heart rate monitor on them and looking at kind of how their stress levels kind of change over time. And a lot of children are very, young children as a whole are more up and down in terms of their levels of kind of stress in their body. We get more stable as we're older. And it's particularly true for some children. So they're very kind of up and down, really hyper one moment and then kind of really crashing the next. So we know that when we listen to music, our heart beats synchronized to the rate of the music, the pulse in the music. That's why we listen to fast-paced music when we're working out and slow-paced music when we're trying to get kids to sleep. And music, by definition, is regular, so it's got a regular pulse. So there is some really good evidence that playing music and having background music to children can just help them to stay in a stable stress state. Yeah, so it stops their stress levels from yo-yoing up and down, and that's one of the reasons it can help. I think just on top of that, there is really good quality evidence that you don't want music that kind of overlaps with your voice when you're talking to them. So you don't, for example, want to be playing music where there's someone singing, because that will be more distracting for the children. There'll be create more interference between the music and your voice that you want them to tune into. Also in terms of pitch, yeah. So you don't want to, if your voice is kind of high pitched, then you don't want to have high pitched music. You want to have low pitched music. So the more distinct you can make the music from your voice, then that helps. But in principle, that's why it helps, as long as you do it kind of in that way.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it can just add to the overall noise level, can't it? I've kind of read studies about that as well, that sometimes it's effective and it might make the children calmer and quieter. But other times, if you've got kind of quite a noisy classroom to begin with lots of chatter, and then you put on some nursery rhymes in the background or something, it just adds to the overall noise level. Then the children have to talk louder to be heard over the top of the music. And so it just kind of keeps on increasing and increasing. But I think it feeds into as well, we're talking sort of, I think we mentioned this earlier about, one environment is never going to be optimal for all of the children. So some children, in a setting might respond really, really well to having music in the background and find that really calming. But other children are not going to respond so well, and it might, might make them louder and might make them overstimulated. And we kind of talk about that challenge as well. We kind of have a chapter about, how can you manage to kind of work with lots and lots of different children in one setting when they've all got different needs in terms of what they need the environment to be like for them to pay attention the best they can.
And I was just going to say that kind of brings me on to talking about the fact that you mentioned that very young children really struggle with that kind of auditory and visual clutter. What about children with other needs, so ADHD and autism, things like that? I guess that's a big consideration in your work as well.
Yeah, I think, so generally, I think the same basic rules apply, that when I'm highly stressed, so I'm in a high stress state, so my heart's beating fast, what we call kind of fight or flight mode, where you're breathing fast, you're sweating, you're in a kind of high state of excitement, then you tend to be more distractible. So what we were talking about attention capture, movement, bright lights, that type of stuff, that increases when I'm in a high stress state. And then when I'm in a low stress state, when I'm, a bit drowsy, my eyelids are drooping, I'm very calm, very sitting still, then you probably have kind of difficulties focusing on anything. So if I'm in a high stress state, I want to be reducing the environment, reducing the stimulation, the attention capture in the environment in order to help me focus. But if I'm in a very low stress state and I'm kind of very kind of under kind of stressed, then kind of the same types of things can actually help me to get me back to my kind of optimal level. But that basic rule, honestly, Angelica, is kind of operates very similarly across children with, ADHD, children with autism and that type of stuff. But they will often have very particular patterns of how their stress levels are atypical. Yeah. And it's actually very complex. So children with ADHD, there are groups that tend to be very, hyperactive, particularly the hyperactive subtype. But we're increasingly realizing that one really underdiagnosed group is kind of children who are much calmer, who have what we call the inattentive subtype of ADHD. So they're the ones who'll be sitting looking at you, but inside they'll be having really problems kind of focusing on what you're saying. Similarly, children with autism, there are definitely kind of hyperactive subtypes and hypoactive subtypes, so they're under-aroused subtypes. So, but the same basic principles apply, as I say, but it's just really, really important to be, tracking the state, the kind of stress state of your children, and thinking, how do I nudge them into, how do I change the environment, how do I change how I'm interacting with them in order to nudge them into this, optimal state, kind of halfway between overexcited and underexcited.
That's really interesting. Really finding that balance is important. What were you going to say? Sorry.
Well, I just was going to say, I was looking at you, Gemma, because I know it's your favourite topic about self-calibrating. Do you want to talk about that, or do you want me to talk about it?
No, I'm happy to talk about that.
All right, you talk.
So we talk about as I mentioned, because it's difficult to adapt the environment to suit everybody, then kind of the best we can probably do when we're working with a big group of children is to allow them the capacity to self-calibrate so they can nudge up their kind of, how stimulated they are, so that it suits them. So, for example, allowing a child to move when they feel that they need to move, rather than telling them, stop fidgeting, you need to sit still, put your hands in your lap. As I said earlier, that can be kind of fidgeting around can be misconstrued as sort of low level destructive behaviour, whereas actually that might be that child trying really hard to self-regulate. They might know that they're a little bit under stressed, as Sam said, or under aroused, and they need to just up their level of stimulation to help themselves stay focused. And they might be tapping or rocking or fidgeting to help themselves focus in on what you're saying or try and pay attention to that particular activity. But if we shut that down, then we're actually kind of working against them. And I think it's really difficult when you're working with a lot of young children. It's very tempting to put a lot of control in, to try and micromanage every little thing, sort of tell them where to sit, how to sit, when you can speak, when you can't speak. But actually sometimes that makes our job more difficult to get children into that kind of optimal state.
Can I just add a couple of things to that as well? So one thing is these fidgety movements often tend to be quite rhythmic. So children with autism, often things like hand flapping. But the same thing applies to virtually everyone. It's the same as chewing gum. So chewing gum is quite rhythmic. I'm quite hyperactive, quite ADHD, and I just was noticing myself doing that, just like a repetitive movement. But the reason that they help to keep a stable arousal state is exactly the same as with music. So introducing something repetitive, that's rhythmic and periodic, like hand flapping or like rhythmic chewing, just helps me to maintain an even kind of level between, if I'm cycling up or cycling down. So that's one thing I wanted to say. But also the other thing, and this is something I think about a lot, which is one of the reasons that I think it's very easy and it's very tempting for a lot of people to really clamp down on children fidgeting is if you think about your perspective from the teacher, you're doing circle time and you're sitting talking to the children. Most of the children are still, and there's one children in your setting who's moving a lot. Yeah. It drives your attention capture, because of what Gemma was saying earlier. Our attention is automatically driven to movement, So this is something that very much attracts your attention, But if you think about it from the point of view of the children as a whole, particularly if that child who's fidgeting is positioned towards the back of the group, he's not in line of sight for the other children, so it's not affecting their attention at all. So what you really get is a teacher, who's very much stuck in their perspective and saying, this is distracting for me, but hang about, you're the teacher, you're supposed to be able to cope with that. Think about it from the child's point of view. And for the reasons that Gemma was just saying, the child is fidgeting because they're trying to manage their own state to help them to concentrate. So that just was something I wanted to add.
That's really interesting. It's so important for the teachers to be aware then as well. And I guess it is a consideration of like you said, as a teacher, you should be able to focus and concentrate, but actually it is really difficult as well, isn't it, for adults too, and not just for young children, especially if the adult has also got ADHD or something like that is also making it difficult for them to focus as well.
Yeah, when I went into a school quite recently and I was talking about kind of the physical environment and why kind of having a lot of clutter in the room is a problem, and the head teacher was saying, some is really interesting because some of my teachers keep their classrooms really tidy and really streamlined, and some of them just always want loads of things on the walls, and they have loads of things hanging from the ceiling, and they've always got music on, and how do I manage that and kind of get it more consistent? And I was saying, well, I guess we also have to think about that teacher's own needs. And you've probably got some teachers that need that extra level of stimulation in the environment, and that works really well for them, whereas other teachers find that really overstimulating. So, we want to put the children's needs first, but we probably do also have to acknowledge, you've got a range of adults working in the school as well, and they've all got different environments that are optimal for them.
And I was going to go back to, so you mentioned the Goldilocks zone of arousal for optimal attention. And I guess you kind of mentioned this already in terms of supporting children to self-regulate and find that balance between that alertness and calmness. And a lot of the time we really try to calm children down. And I've had a conversation with Samantha Delakia, who's also talking about this and the fact that we should we shouldn't just try and calm children down all the time. We need to kind of bring them up as well, like what you were saying in terms of if that level is really low and they're kind of, like you said, kind of falling asleep, and then they're drowsy and they're not really, and then they're definitely not paying attention. So it's important to get them more hyped up, I guess, which seems like the opposite to what we normally want.
Yeah, I think that again, that is, imposing our norms on children. So adults tend to be calmer and we tend to move less, and that type of thing. And it's not necessarily the case that what is optimal. In fact, we know that it's not the case that what is optimal state for an adult for learning is the same as the optimal state for a child for learning. So there's really good evidence that, in a lot of ways, if they're kind of their kind of mid-range state is higher, then that's the state you want to get them into. So again, I think it's imposing our adult norms on children and not really based on a kind of an in-depth understanding of what's best for the child.
Really interesting. Yeah, it's all about being reflective and aware and understanding all of this and the neuroscience behind it. I guess hence why you're both doing the work that you're doing to raise this awareness for the educators.
Yeah, definitely. And also, Angelica, just to pick up on something you mentioned about this, the Goldilocks zone. So we talk about that in terms of stress. The Goldilocks, the idea is it's not too hot and not too cold.
Yeah.
That's right. It's called a Goldilocks zone. But there's another area that we talk a lot about in the book, which is how other aspects of, the information that you're presenting to children can affect how easy they find it to concentrate on what you're saying. And there's also this idea of an optimal kind of sweet spot in terms of how kind of familiar they are with what you're saying. Yeah. So if it's content that is too familiar, so they've heard it a million times before and they've got nothing to learn from it, then they find it harder to focus. But also if it's too unfamiliar, then they also find it harder to focus. So we talk about this also the same idea of a Goldilocks zone in terms of children naturally pay attention to stuff where they can guess what's going to happen next some of the time, but not all of the time. Yeah. And if you've got children who are having problems focusing, then it could be because it's too easy for them, or it could be because it's too hard. And it's just a question of kind of practically judging how to keep it at that kind of intermediate level for the right number of people. So often, if content is too hard for them, particularly when we're thinking about very young children. So there's really good evidence that, for example, like reading a story 5 times in a row to a young child, or kind of playing a short video clip 5 times in a row to a young child. So I'm thinking babies here now, 12 to 18 month olds, that their attention actually goes up the more times you present it, up to kind of 5 repetitions. And that is because the first time that you did it for them, it was just too hard. Yeah, they couldn't take anything in. Yeah, but then the more they're presented with the same content again and again and again, the more they start to understand it. And as they understand it, it gets to a point that the kind of the beginning growth of understanding actually improves their concentration. So, that's also something to think about. Yeah, if I've got problems, children who are problems with focusing, is it too hard or is it too easy? And if it's too hard, what can I do? How can I use things like repetition to try to make it easier for children to focus on what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I think that feeds in really well to sort of adult expectations as well. So sometimes, another reason why we wrote this book is because increasingly people were kind of coming to us saying, oh, we're really struggling with children's focus and attention, more so than ever since COVID. And, people saying things like, oh, definitely like 3/4 of my class have got ADHD. And, that's not going to be the case that 3/4 of the class have got ADHD. If it feels like that, if the vast majority of the children aren't able to concentrate and focus on what's happening, then as Sam said, it's probably that the content is too difficult. It might be environmental factors as well, but highly likely that what we're expecting them to do, either in terms of the duration of time we expect them to focus for, or the difficulty of the content is just too much for them. So, if it is new material, if it's something they haven't come across before, and we know it's quite challenging, we're going to have to adapt our expectations. Whereas usually that teacher input part of the lesson might be 15 minutes, then in that situation, maybe it's only going to be 5 minutes, might only be 2 minutes, because it is going to be so much more taxing for them to take on, that new information.
And I guess this is again where I come back to that awareness and teacher training on neuroscience is so vital. And from what I've heard and from my experience, we just don't have enough of that in our training at all. And then, these problems happen of like, we're wondering why are children so misbehaving so much and not paying attention. And yes, we do say a lot of the time, we need to meet the children where they are at. And it's not the child that's the problem. It might be the fact that we're not providing them with the right environment and things like that. But even then it kind of stops there because you don't have the knowledge, the research to back it up of like, okay, we're not providing the environment, but what does that actually mean? Is there much more depth that they can kind of tap into there? They just don't have the skills and the knowledge because we don't have enough training around all of this.
Yeah, I think there are two aspects of that I think that are really important, Angelica, is just we don't know. We're starting to uncover from these neuroscience studies just how differently children experience the sights and sounds around them compared to how we experience them as adults. Yeah. So take, for example, that idea that we started with of this, our brains are so good at tuning in to one talker in what we call a multi-talker environment where I can hear multiple people talking at once. I'm choosing to focus on you. And our adult brains are so good at doing that. We're so trained at doing that, but we're not aware what a phenomenally hard job it is that our brains are doing. So, we're actually kind of predicting, there's all sorts of amazing studies that, at each word that's coming out of your mouth as you're speaking, I'm guessing what word you're going to say next, and I'm tuning in to what I expect you to use, and it's an incredibly hard job for our brains to do. And it's only recently that we've started to realise that children's brains find that same type of task much harder than adults do. So that's what drives what Gemma was talking about earlier about some adults will walk into a setting and start having a conversation while you're trying to read the story to the kids. They're just not aware that children's subjective experience is so different to yours. And then the other thing is the idea of kind of pacing and how much content children can kind of process and the speed at which that changes. So so there's a lovely study with kind of 15-month-old baby. So the fastest that we can see, the fastest that we can perceive is 10 frames a second. So 10 flickers a second is the fastest that we. In a 15-month-old, it's 1 frame a second. So anything that's been and gone in less than a second is just too fast for them to perceive. They can't see it. And similarly, a lot of the content, a lot of the kind of stories that we give children, and a lot of the TV as well, we'll get onto technology in a second, it just happens at a speed that's too fast for children's brains to keep up. And as I say, it's really only recently, since we started to really measure children's brain activity, that we've started to realize just this idea that they just need stuff to be so much more slow, and they need these things like repetition and things like that because their own experience is very different to ours as adults.
That's so interesting to hear that everything is kind of built on that previous experience, which we do know already. We talk about that when we learn about early childhood theory, but we don't link that enough to then the neuroscience as well. We link the theory to practice, but the neuroscience in the middle kind of gets a bit lost there. And you mentioned technology there. So there's obviously a lot of, it is quite a controversial topic around, children being more kind of distractible or actually being distracted, technology being used as a tool to distract children and to kind of keep them focused on something whilst especially, parents and carers and family members get on with something else. So I think, technology is a big conversation here. Is it something that you do a lot of work on as well?
Yeah, shall I talk about this? So yeah, I think that the two things that are important, I think, to emphasize is, Gemma was talking earlier about kind of this idea of attention capture. So movement and things kind of moving and flashing and brightly colored salient things are easy for our brains to pay attention to. Yeah, it's a very early developing brain mechanism that, as Gemma was saying earlier, we've developed like that because it used to be very important for us that we were very aware of things moving because that was more likely to be something dangerous or something that we could eat. So that's why our brains are developed to pay a lot of attention to movement. So those attention capture mechanisms are why even young children never have any problems paying attention to screens, because screens are very skillfully designed to be constantly moving, to be very brightly coloured, to be constantly kind of attracting our attention. But because of that, what they're potentially missing out on is the other side of it, what we call the good side of attention, which is the attention control, which comes, as Gemma was saying, from a very different part of the brain, which is much more about, me choosing what I pay attention to. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Screens are designed so that, particularly for young children, we never have to choose what to pay attention to. It's always the bit that's moving that is driving their attention. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing that I think is important about screens. And the other thing goes back to what I was just saying about stuff happening too fast. Yeah. So 50-month-olds, 1 second, 1 frame per second is the fastest that they can see. Yeah. And anything that faster than that, they just can't process. And we know that if I'm in a situation where, information is coming at me faster than I can process, and I can't predict what I'm going to see next because, I'm getting overwhelmed with the speed at which content is coming at me, we know that affects our kind of stress levels. So if I'm in an unpredictable situation, I go into a high stress mode. So, my heartbeat will start to beat faster. I'll start to pay attention to things differently and that type of thing. So one of the other big things to think about in terms of, early screen use is fast-paced content drives kind of elevated stress in children, which, as we've been talking about, then changes how children pay attention. So those are the two things I think are really important with screens. Gemma, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, we do talk as well about some positive uses of technology. I think there's a lot out there at the moment about the bad side of technology. But in terms of capturing children's attention, we've talked about things being at the optimal level for children, not too hard and not too easy. And there are some uses of technology that are great for that, the learning software that uses AI to kind of target the questions at exactly the right level. There are quite a lot of programs like that now for like reading, and my youngest son's been doing Duolingo recently. That's really good as well. As soon as you get a question wrong, it doesn't take you back to the beginning. It just gives you a slightly easier one, and then it will build you up, slowly. A lot of them as well even know how long it takes you to answer. So you're answering very quickly and confidently is going to up the level. And so it can do that targeted differentiation at such an exact level that we just can't replicate as humans. You're never going to be able to do that. So there are some uses of it like that where it can actually really help, support attention in a very positive way. But as Sam was said, there's more kind of, this more passive consumption of very fast-paced media is much more likely to be detrimental.
That's interesting that you mentioned there that passive consumption is more detrimental rather than kind of actively engaging in something. And then I guess if you're actively engaging, then you are choosing what to pay attention to. And that's kind of the difference that you're pointing out there.
Yeah, there's a big difference between the literature on, telly, which just tends to just happen, and you just sit and watch, and kind of interactive things like, learning games, obviously, as Gemma was just saying, but also computer games where you're in control of the character. And there's a lot more evidence for beneficial effects from kind of interactive, I'm controlling a character and they're moving. So, yeah, you're right. It's a really important differentiation that not many people think about, honestly, when they think about screen time.
Yeah, and I guess also what you mentioned there in terms of fast-paced content driving that elevated stress in children, I guess this is why a lot of the time we see children being quite stressed and overwhelmed and highly kind of aroused after having exposure to technology and using technology, I guess because it is passive, and it kind of then that's when you can see those issues where children may get quite dysregulated and they can't regulate the fact that their technology is being taken away from them.
Yeah, you're literally in fight or flight mode. So often, it's the fast-paced content, but another aspect of it is often if you've been watching a show about a character in simulated danger. So there's a lot of, even in good quality series content, there's a lot of shows about, the world's about to end or something like that. And if you're if you're watching someone who's in simulated danger, there's a lot of evidence that children's bodies respond to that simulated danger as if they're experiencing the danger themselves. So they go into what we call fight or flight mode. So I mentioned it earlier, your heart starts to beat faster, you start to sweat to cool yourself down, and you get a massive release of energy to your muscles. And that, as you say, Angelica, that's why it's often so hard to get screens off kids, because they come off the screen, they're right in fight or flight mode, and they're absolutely ready for a fight. So that is the time when, things like throwing open if you're lucky enough to have a garden, then throwing open the garden doors and saying, right, run it off outside, and you need a bit of outdoors because, as you've really covered in a lot of detail with Gemma, outdoor settings are very calming for children, and it's a really good way to get out of fight or flight mode as well as kind of running off excess energy. So, transitioning from screen time straight to green time is obviously a great kind of practical tip if you can.
Yeah,
I like
a lot
that
better
quite.
than trying to transition from screen time to dinner time, which is what I tried for years to do in my house. Right, come on, boys, off the screens, it's time for dinner. And then they come bundling into the kitchen, like, absolute mayhem. Not very conducive to then sitting down nice and calmly for a good family meal. So, yeah, it's probably about the time, working out your timing as well of those transitions and which activity children are moving into after they've just been on the technology.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And so Gemma, I know we already mentioned that we've kind of covered a lot on the Voice of Early Childhood podcast around the science behind outdoor play, but let's kind of bring it back a little bit into this neuroscientific context even more and kind of recap, or maybe you've had further thoughts around concentration and the outdoors. So can you tell us a little bit about, I guess, maybe what you've included in the book around this?
Yeah, so a lot of it is based on, what we talked about on previous podcasts from the research study that I did, where we found that even when children were doing the same activities with the same resources, outdoors and inside, for some children at least, their kind of engagement and focus was much, much better when they were outdoors. And I do say some children because it's not true. It wasn't true of all of them. Some children focus better inside and some better outside. And I think it's mainly because a lot of the reasons that we've already covered. So the noise levels, for example, they're often much lower outdoors because there aren't all of these different surfaces, walls and ceilings for the noises to reverberate off of. So you're not getting that intermingling of lots and lots of different sounds, that kind of cacophony of sounds that you get indoors. And similarly with the visual clutter as well, we've said indoors you might have lots of displays and things hanging from the ceiling and a much wider range of different colours and shapes and so on. Whereas if you're going to take your book outside and read in the park, you're going to have kind of fewer visual distractions, you're going to have mainly kind of natural colours, greens and muted colours and so on. So it's less kind of visually taxing than the indoor environment. And as Sam mentioned as well, the stress levels of children are, at a more optimal level of stress outdoors. And it seems to be quite a good, quite a good kind of balancing act of children that need upregulating. Being outside in the fresh air gives them that boost, that additional stimulation. And the children who need to come down a notch is good for them too. So it seems that it can either kind of reduce or elevate your level of stimulation.
Yeah, no, there's not a lot actually. I'm trying to think of a study that's actually shown that, but that is definitely my impression too, Gemma. But
no, I mean, there's definitely not enough research on it, but
it seems to make sense in terms of providing that balance. When even with just thinking about the simple thing of having more space outdoors, and the children who need that space to, like you mentioned earlier, run around and kind of use up that energy, they can do that. And then the children that need to sit down, they can do that. And they're almost like, because of that wide space, they're not then affecting each other as much in terms of if one's kind of up and one's down. Yeah, I think even it's something like that, the space kind of plays a big role, even though that's not very kind of neuroscientific. But
yeah, we do quite a lot of research on that, actually, Angelica. That's a really nice point that we hadn't mentioned, this idea of stress contagion. It's an under-researched area, but we're trying to do research with our kind of designing these little wearable sensors to look at how you're affected by the kind of mood states around you. So it's actually a really good point.
Mood states around you. That's really interesting. Yeah, maybe that could be another episode in future then, when you've done a little bit more research around that.
Yeah, really up for that. Yeah.
Well, I think we've covered quite a lot there, and it's really interesting to kind of hear your research and everything with this book. It's years of your own reading and research and work. So it's great to be able to, I guess, for you guys to bring it into something tangible and very practical as well. I know that there's lots of practical tips there that you mentioned as well for educators. So I think it's definitely going to be. It certainly is a very much needed resource, and it's going to be something that I think educators will be able to kind of come back to when they need it as well. Probably that's kind of the sense that I get from the book.
Yeah, we hope so. We kind of worked really hard to make it easy to dip in and out of, really accessible. We know kind of how exhausted
Hmm.
everybody is at the end of the day, and they don't want to read like really dense pages of lots and lots of sort of neuroscientific theory. So we've tried to make it really kind of accessible, easy to read, as you said, like lots and
Hmm.
lots of different practical tips, and it's all kind of broken down on the page as well, so it's sort of like visually quite easy to process as well.
Hmm.
Yeah, and I mean maybe just to kind of wrap up because there's a yeah the I think for me as a neuroscientist I think the theoretical side of it is really important
Hmm.
and yeah, we do talk about that quite a lot. Is this idea that we shouldn't be thinking of concentration in terms of brain training, in terms of a mental muscle that is good in some children and bad in others. But instead, if we've got a child who's not concentrating, we should be thinking, how can we make these little micro adjustments? So how can we nudge, the setting, the level of stimulation they're getting in the setting? Do they need to be nudged a little bit up and down? How do we nudge the complexity of the information that we're presenting? How much we give them new information versus how much we
Hmm.
information. And it's really this question of, it's not an individual child who's got a weak muscle in their brain that means they can't concentrate, but it's rather just about, finding the optimal setting for that child. And the optimal setting differs between children and there's no kind of right or wrong.
Hmm.
So yeah, that for me is the most important thing, I think.
Hmm. And it just kind of, in terms of early years, it really brings us back to the unique child, and every child is unique. And like you say, every setting would be, um, they'd experience it differently, and there's an optimal kind of setting or experience for every single child.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, fantastic. Well, thank you both so much for coming onto the podcast and sharing your work and your newly published book as well. So for everyone who is listening or watching, you can read Gemma's and Sam's article on the Voice of Early Childhood website. There's a link to the book there, which you can take a look at. And also, of course, Gemma's podcast series around the science behind outdoor play. That'd be great to have a look back at that if you haven't already listened or read the articles. That's really interesting, and there's a lot there to delve into and unpick as well. So, yeah, once again, thank you both very, very much. And I'm looking forward to hearing more about your work in future.
Great,
Thanks for
lovely.
having
Thanks.
us.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Angelica. It's been fun.